On the warm spring evening of May 5, 2009, a quiet calm lay over the suburban neighborhood of Austin, Texas. Sunlight had faded into a peaceful twilight, casting a gentle glow over the homes nestled along tree-lined streets. The Ramirez household, like many others, appeared serene, a picture of stability in a bustling city. Inside, however, this was far from the truth. Lucia Ramirez was known in her community as the devoted mother and ideal wife. At 34, she had everything a woman might want: a steady husband, 2 beautiful children, and a well-kept home. She was the one neighbors saw at the park with her kids, her laughter soft yet genuine, her patience endless. And while everything about Lucia screamed perfect, those closest to her knew the strain that lay beneath her polished exterior. Lucia's husband, Carlos Ramirez, had built his life around hard work. As a construction supervisor, he poured long hours into his job, often leaving at dawn and returning well after dark. His dedication was undeniable, he wore it like armor. But his career, as steady as it was, had come at a price. The emotional closeness he and Lucia once shared had withered in the face of his relentless work ethic. Their conversations had grown brief and impersonal, reduced to quick exchanges about bills, the kids, and daily chores. To outsiders, Carlos was a good husband, a responsible man who provided for his family. But to Lucia, he had become distant, a shadow passing through the house, physically present yet emotionally absent. She found herself craving attention, warmth, and the passion that had once been a part of their lives. Her heart felt like it was slowly breaking, her once cherished marriage growing colder with every passing day. Enter Gabriel Alvarez. Gabriel, with his easy charm and inviting smile, was the husband of Mariana, Lucia's beloved cousin and closest confidant. The two couples often attended family gatherings together, shared dinners, and celebrated milestones. Over the years, Gabriel had become more than just family, he was a friend. But gradually, a dangerous attraction grew between him and Lucia. Unlike Carlos, who was often too tired or busy to notice her, Gabriel noticed everything. He listened, he complimented, and he showed an interest in her thoughts and feelings, offering her the affection she craved. Initially, Lucia tried to brush off her feelings as harmless admiration. She reminded herself that she was married, that Gabriel was family, that this attraction was fleeting. But the magnetic pull between them became harder to resist, and with each gathering, every casual touch, every lingering look, a fire sparked between them, one that they could barely control. That night, as the city lights twinkled in the distance and the Ramirez house settled into the stillness of another evening, Lucia's secrets remained hidden, cloaked under the calm facade of suburban bliss. The delicate balance she maintained between her duty and desire was slowly unraveling, her need for connection and passion pushing her toward decisions she never thought she would make. And unbeknownst to her, this quiet suburb was about to become the scene of a tragedy that would forever shatter the illusion of perfection. Lucia Ramirez was the kind of woman people respected and admired, someone who seemed to have it all. From the outside, her life looked like a carefully arranged picture of domestic happiness. With her polished manner and gentle demeanor, she gave an air of quiet strength and grace that made her the person neighbors greeted warmly at the grocery store, the friend others confided in. But beneath the calm, Lucia was restless, plagued by the kind of loneliness that clung to her even when surrounded by family. At 34, Lucia's life was full but empty. Her marriage to Carlos, a man once filled with humor and warmth, had slowly devolved into routine. The promises of young love had given way to the unyielding demands of bills, children, and Carlos's relentless work schedule. Carlos was a man of few words, content with providing for his family and assuming that his dedication to his work spoke for his devotion. He was respected, a figure of stability, but with every passing day, he seemed to retreat further into the background of their home, his presence increasingly distant, as if there was a wall between him and the people he loved most. For Carlos, his role as husband and father was anchored in duty. As a construction foreman, he had built a career of hard labor, long hours, and meticulous detail. He left the house early, came home late, and even when he was there, he was still somewhat absent, his thoughts often lingering on unfinished projects and tomorrow's tasks. To him, these sacrifices were proof of his love for Lucia and their children. But while Carlos saw his actions as commitment, Lucia felt the growing space between them like an icy void, one she feared would consume her if nothing changed. Enter Mariana Alvarez, Lucia's cousin, the woman she had grown up beside and cherished like a sister. Mariana and Lucia shared a history that only cousins raised side by side could understand. They were bound by memories of shared birthdays, sleepovers, and whispered dreams. Mariana had been there for Lucia through thick and thin, a steadfast friend whose loyalty was unwavering. Lucia and Mariana confided in each other, navigating the joys and challenges of marriage together. But as time wore on, even Mariana had sensed something changing in Lucia, an air of melancholy she couldn't quite place but that troubled her deeply. And then, there was Gabriel Alvarez, Mariana's husband. A striking man with a magnetic charm and a confidence that made him hard to ignore. Gabriel was successful, a real estate agent with an impressive roster of clients and an even more impressive manner. He was the kind of man who knew how to make people feel seen, his easy smile and careful compliments creating an aura of warmth. Gabriel was everything Carlos was not: attentive, charming, and, above all, present. And as he paid more and more attention to Lucia, her loneliness found solace in his gaze, a gaze that lingered a little too long, one that began to fill her mind in moments of solitude. The two couples often spent time together at family gatherings, neighborhood events, and dinners. But as Gabriel's attention toward Lucia grew, so did the strain between him and Mariana. Lucia, too, felt the weight of her choices bearing down on her, the subtle glances and hidden meanings becoming a dangerous game that neither she nor Gabriel seemed willing to end. There was an undercurrent of attraction, an unspoken connection that sparked and flared each time they were near each other. Gabriel, sensing the distance between Lucia and Carlos, became more emboldened, his interest evolving from harmless flattery to something deeper, more consuming. Lucia told herself it was just a distraction, something temporary to fill the gaps in her marriage. But every time she tried to brush it aside, Gabriel's presence drew her back, igniting a flame she thought had long since died. And with Mariana as her closest confidant, her cousin who trusted her implicitly, Lucia found herself torn between loyalty and desire, love and betrayal. She could see the affection in Mariana's eyes when she looked at Gabriel, the admiration her cousin held for him as a husband and father. The realization gnawed at Lucia, casting her thoughts into turmoil, and yet, she couldn't pull away. Gabriel, too, wrestled with his own sense of right and wrong, but his attraction to Lucia had taken root, consuming him with a quiet obsession. Each secret glance, every stolen moment between them was a thrill, an indulgence that fed his need for excitement. Mariana had no idea, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface of their seemingly stable family. She saw Gabriel as a dedicated husband, someone whose charm and charisma had been a gift to her marriage. But behind her back, his affections had shifted to someone else, someone she trusted more than anyone. As the months passed, the attraction between Lucia and Gabriel became harder to deny. Both knew the consequences, both understood the danger, but the pull was intoxicating, the thrill blinding them to the heartbreak they would soon unleash. In the quiet moments, when all were gathered together, their secrets hung heavy in the air, a tension that only the two of them could feel, the weight of which would soon push their lives into a tragic spiral. As the months wore on, the quiet distance between Lucia and Carlos grew wider, like a slow drift pulling them apart. Their marriage, once warm and filled with laughter, had become a series of routines, a shared life made up of passing moments and empty conversations. Their home, cozy and filled with memories, began to feel like a hollow shell, each room echoing the silence that now filled their relationship. Carlos's devotion to his work had always been his way of showing love, a way to provide security and stability. He was a man of actions rather than words, believing that by working tirelessly he was keeping his family safe, ensuring they had everything they needed. He left home each day before the sun rose, his tools and lunch packed neatly beside the door, and returned well after dusk, worn down and weary. Lucia would wait for him, but the warmth of greeting him had faded into habit. Their conversations grew shorter, with topics limited to bills, household tasks, and updates about the children. Carlos was oblivious to the fact that, in his absence, something vital was slipping away. To him, their life was a series of sacrifices worth making, a noble cause where love meant commitment to duty. But for Lucia, love was something she needed to feel, not just something to understand as implied in actions. She longed for moments of affection, tenderness, and the simple pleasure of feeling seen and valued. The small gestures, the shared laughter, the long conversations they once had, all of these things had vanished, leaving Lucia to live within the shadows of what her marriage used to be. She began to feel as if her own needs and desires were buried beneath Carlos's endless work and responsibilities. She wanted to feel alive, not just as a mother or wife, but as a woman. Yet every time she tried to reach out, tried to express herself, she was met with a polite nod or a quick acknowledgement, like an afterthought that Carlos hurriedly tucked away so he could return to his focus on work. His sense of duty felt like a wall, one she couldn't climb over or tear down. And so, over time, she stopped trying, learning to live with the ache that had become a constant companion. This hollow ache left Lucia vulnerable, her heart open to a dangerous longing she couldn't ignore. Gabriel's attention began to fill that void, his laughter and his presence offering her the kind of companionship she had once found in Carlos. Gabriel noticed her, not just as a mother or wife, but as a woman, an individual with thoughts, dreams, and desires of her own. The moments they shared were fleeting, innocent enough on the surface, but beneath each interaction lay an intensity that made her pulse quicken, her heart race with the thrill of something forbidden. Lucia's guilt was there, ever present, gnawing at her each time she allowed herself to enjoy Gabriel's attention. She knew it was wrong, knew that Carlos trusted her, that Mariana adored her husband and saw their marriage as unbreakable. But the emptiness she felt was too deep, too consuming to ignore. In the quiet of the night, as she lay next to Carlos, who fell asleep almost instantly after a long day, Lucia's mind would drift to Gabriel. She would replay his compliments, his glances, and wonder if he thought of her the same way. She hated herself for it but felt powerless to change it. Their marriage continued to function outwardly, they appeared as the stable, happy couple everyone thought they were. They attended family gatherings, dinners, and neighborhood events side by side, performing the roles expected of them. But when she looked at Carlos, Lucia saw a man more invested in his obligations than in her. And when he looked at her, he saw a wife, a role, a fixture, never the woman struggling beneath the weight of unmet needs and unspoken desires. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Lucia finally tried to talk to him, hoping to break through the barrier that had formed between them. "Carlos," she began, her voice soft, tentative, "do you ever feel like we've lost something? Like, we're not as close as we used to be?" Carlos glanced at her, the weariness evident in his eyes. "It's just part of life, Lucia," he replied, his tone gentle but dismissive. "We have responsibilities, kids to raise, bills to pay. This is what marriage is, what we signed up for." His words left her cold, as if he had unwittingly closed the door on a part of her she could no longer reach. She nodded, swallowing her frustration, the hollow ache in her chest deepening. Carlos turned off the bedside lamp, closed his eyes, and drifted off to sleep, while Lucia lay awake, staring into the darkness, feeling more alone than ever. In the weeks that followed, Lucia found herself drifting even further from him, sinking deeper into her own thoughts, her own private longings. She no longer tried to reach out, no longer tried to bridge the gap. Instead, she began to live within her own world, a place where she was free to feel, to imagine, and to explore the what-ifs that haunted her. Gabriel's presence in her life grew more vivid, filling her thoughts as Carlos's presence faded into routine. Lucia knew the danger that lay in the path she was treading, but the emptiness she felt pushed her forward, each step bringing her closer to a place she could not return from. She was caught between duty and desire, torn between loyalty and the ache to feel alive once more. And as her marriage continued its slow decline, she felt herself slipping further and further into the orbit of something she could not resist. It began subtly, like a spark catching dry wood, small, flickering, almost innocent. Lucia never intended for things with Gabriel to cross any lines, never imagined she would jeopardize her marriage, her family, her life. But with each passing day, her feelings for him grew, fed by the loneliness she carried and the warmth he offered. Their connection was undeniable, building with every shared glance, every quiet moment that stretched too long, every lingering touch that sent a shiver through her. The affair started innocently enough. At family gatherings, Gabriel would find her in the crowd, his eyes meeting hers from across the room, a silent understanding passing between them. He seemed to know exactly how to make her laugh, his sense of humor a welcome relief from the monotony of her daily life. They shared stories, inside jokes, and soon those small moments of connection became her anchor, her escape. But the longing between them was becoming too potent to ignore. A chance touch as he passed her a drink, a laugh that lingered a moment too long, each interaction ignited a thrill that Lucia hadn't felt in years. Soon, it wasn't enough to see him only at family events. They began to make excuses to meet. Gabriel would text her from time to time, and each message felt like a stolen breath of air. She'd catch herself smiling at her phone, her heart racing as she waited for his name to appear. These messages were brief, often mundane, but the subtext was electric. They both knew they were playing a dangerous game. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, and Lucia was running errands when her phone buzzed with a message from Gabriel. "I'm in the area," it read. "Got a few minutes to spare. Coffee?" Lucia hesitated, her heart pounding. She knew that meeting him alone was a line she shouldn't cross, but the lure was too strong. She found herself replying before she had time to think, agreeing to meet him at a small cafe on the edge of town, a place where no one would recognize them. When she walked in, Gabriel was already there, a mischievous smile on his face, his eyes lighting up as he saw her. They sat across from each other, sipping their coffee, making small talk as if nothing was unusual. But beneath the surface, every word, every glance, felt charged. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers lightly, and a shock ran through her, sending her heart racing. She glanced around, conscious of the world outside their bubble, yet unable to pull her hand away. "It's been a while since I've seen you smile like that," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. Lucia felt a blush creeping up her cheeks, the heat of his gaze flustering her in a way she hadn't experienced in years. I haven't had much to smile about lately," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Gabriel's hand tightened over hers, his thumb tracing circles against her skin. "You deserve to be happy, Lucia. You deserve to feel alive." His words struck her deeply, resonating with a longing she had tried to ignore. She wanted to pull away, to preserve some semblance of loyalty to Carlos, but the warmth of Gabriel's touch and the intensity of his gaze melted her resolve. In that moment, she felt like the only woman in the world, cherished and adored, a sensation she hadn't known in years. Their meetings became more frequent. A secret rendezvous at the cafe became lunch dates, and soon, Lucia and Gabriel were inventing reasons to see each other. The thrill of sneaking around, of sharing hidden glances and whispered conversations, became intoxicating. Each time they parted, Lucia felt an ache in her chest, a yearning that only grew stronger. She was living a double life, a life filled with moments of passion and excitement that contrasted sharply with the predictability of her days with Carlos. One evening, under the cover of dusk, Gabriel invited her to his car after one of their meetings. They sat in the quiet darkness, their proximity intense and overwhelming. Without thinking, he leaned in, his hand cupping her cheek, and kissed her, softly at first, then with an urgency that made her heart race. Lucia responded, her fingers threading through his hair, her own longing fueling the embrace. In that stolen moment, Lucia forgot about her obligations, her marriage, and the guilt that nagged at her. With Gabriel, She felt alive, consumed by a desire that filled every corner of her heart. She knew it was wrong, knew the consequences if they were discovered, but the thrill of being wanted, of feeling the heat of someone's touch, overpowered her sense of right and wrong. Their affair escalated quickly after that night. Every encounter grew bolder, their passion more intense, until they were sneaking into hotels under false names, caught up in a whirlwind of secrecy and desire. The thrill of getting caught only made it more exhilarating, and they became reckless, ignoring the boundaries they had once clung to. Each meeting was a blur of passion, a temporary escape from the lives they had grown to resent. Lucia's heart was divided, torn between her duties as a wife and mother and the fervent love she felt for Gabriel. She knew that her happiness came at a cost, that the betrayal she was living would hurt the people she cared about most. But in those moments with Gabriel, the weight of reality faded, replaced by the pure, heady thrill of forbidden love. As the affair deepened, Lucia felt herself falling into Gabriel's world, the allure of their shared passion binding her to him in ways she couldn't escape. She was past the point of no return, caught in a tangled web of emotions, desire, and deception. And with each passing day, the line between duty and desire blurred, pushing them both closer to a devastating collision they could no longer avoid. The morning of May 5, 2009, began as any other. Lucia stood in her kitchen, her hands working methodically as she prepared breakfast for her two children, the scent of coffee filling the quiet house. Carlos had already left for work, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hall before the front door closed behind him. She watched him leave with a twinge of guilt, the double life she led hanging over her like a dark cloud. But today was different. Today, she and Gabriel had planned a meeting that felt like a promise, a way to escape, if only for a few precious hours. As the children left for school, Lucia changed into a simple blouse and jeans, her heart pounding as she checked her reflection. She looked ordinary, a typical suburban wife, but beneath that familiar exterior was a woman prepared to risk everything. She was waiting for Gabriel. They had arranged this meeting days ago, choosing the quiet hours of midday to ensure they wouldn't be interrupted. Just past noon, Lucia heard the sound of a car pulling up in the driveway. She opened the door before Gabriel could even knock, her face breaking into a smile as he stepped inside. The house was silent, the perfect backdrop for their stolen moment. Gabriel leaned in, his hand brushing against her cheek, his kiss a familiar warmth that made her forget everything else. They moved together as if caught in a spell, oblivious to the world outside. But that day, something shifted between them. As they pulled apart, Lucia found herself feeling strangely empty. The thrill of their affair, once so exhilarating, had taken on a darker edge. The weight of her secret had become unbearable, the lines they had crossed now impossible to erase. And Gabriel sensed it too. A tension hung between them, unspoken but palpable, as if they both knew that this couldn't continue without shattering the lives they had tried so hard to protect. "I can't do this anymore, Gabriel," Lucia whispered, pulling away. "I can't keep lying to my family. To Carlos. To Mariana. It's destroying me." Gabriel's face hardened, a look of disbelief flickering in his eyes. "So, what? You're just going to walk away?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a dangerous edge. Lucia looked down, her hands trembling. "It has to stop. I can't keep pretending this isn't tearing me apart. And if you don't agree, if you don't leave me alone, I'll have no choice but to tell Mariana everything. She deserves to know the truth." The words fell between them like a challenge, her ultimatum setting off something dark within Gabriel. For a brief moment, his face twisted with anger, his calm demeanor cracking as he stared at her, the gravity of her words sinking in. The thought of losing her, of having his life exposed, left him in a rage he couldn't control. In his mind, the walls were closing in, and he could see no way out. He reached for the kitchen counter, his fingers curling around a knife, the metal cold and heavy in his hand. "What are you doing, Gabriel?" Lucia's voice was trembling now, her eyes widening as she realized what was happening. But in that instant, Gabriel's vision blurred, his anger overtaking him. Before he could think, before he could stop, he lunged forward, the knife slicing through the air in a swift, desperate motion. Lucia gasped, her body frozen in shock as the blade found its mark, her hands clutching at her chest as she sank to the floor. The warmth she had once felt for him was replaced by a cold, numbing pain that spread through her with each passing second. As she lay there, her breaths shallow and ragged, Gabriel's expression shifted from rage to horror. He stared down at his hands, the blood staining his skin, the reality of what he had done crashing over him like a tidal wave. Panic set in, his mind racing with the consequences, the lives he had destroyed with a single, irreversible act. He looked around the room, his heart pounding as he tried to think, tried to grasp some semblance of control. But there was no undoing what he had done. No way to take back the violence, the choice that had shattered everything. Desperate, he grabbed a kitchen towel, wiping his hands, frantically pacing as he struggled to calm his racing thoughts. The room felt smaller, suffocating, the walls pressing in on him as he tried to decide what to do next. Realizing he couldn't stay, that he had to leave before anyone found him, Gabriel stumbled out of the house, his mind a blur of panic and dread. He fled to his car, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, forcing himself to breathe, to think. In the rearview mirror, he saw the house behind him, Lucia's sanctuary, now a crime scene he had created. Without looking back, he started the engine and drove away, each mile separating him from the life he had once known, the people he had once loved. Meanwhile, the house fell silent once more, the calm shattered, leaving only the echoes of what had transpired. Hours later, when Carlos returned home, he found the door ajar, the eerie quiet settling over him like a warning. He stepped inside, calling Lucia's name, his voice filled with the expectation of a typical evening. But as he entered the kitchen, the sight before him struck like a blow, leaving him breathless, paralyzed by the horror that lay before him. Lucia's lifeless body lay crumpled on the floor, her eyes closed, her expression frozen in pain. Carlos fell to his knees, his mind unable to process the scene, the reality of what had happened. His voice trembled as he dialed for help, his hands shaking, his world crumbling around him. The home they had built, the life they had shared, was now a place of unspeakable tragedy. And as the sirens wailed in the distance, the peace of their quiet neighborhood was shattered, the lives of everyone around them forever changed by the crime that had been born of passion, desperation, and betrayal. The sun had barely risen when the Austin Police Department arrived at the Ramirez residence, the tranquility of the neighborhood disrupted by the presence of flashing lights and officers. Detective Juan Garcia, a seasoned investigator known for his relentless approach and keen instincts, stepped out of his car, his gaze narrowing as he surveyed the scene. The Ramirez home, an unassuming, modest house in a peaceful suburb, now held the kind of secrets Garcia was all too familiar with. Garcia entered the house, the air heavy with a silence that felt oppressive. The crime scene was in the kitchen, a room that once symbolized family and comfort, now tainted with horror. Lucia's body lay still on the cold, tiled floor, a pool of blood surrounding her as the forensic team moved carefully, gathering every piece of evidence they could find. Garcia stood back for a moment, his expression unreadable, taking in the details with a practiced eye. A single, clean stab wound to the chest. No sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, just the haunting stillness of a life ended abruptly. Carlos Ramirez, sitting in the living room, was surrounded by officers, his face pale and eyes red from hours of weeping. Garcia approached him, his steps measured as he knelt beside Carlos, placing a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Ramirez," Garcia said quietly, his tone calm, a voice designed to extract the truth from even the most guarded. "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions." Carlos looked up, his face etched with disbelief and despair. I don't understand. She was fine when I left this morning. We had breakfast together, she kissed me goodbye, and then," his voice trailed off, the weight of reality sinking in once more. Garcia's gaze softened momentarily before his questions resumed. Did Lucia have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm her? Carlos shook his head, his confusion evident. No, no one. Lucia was loved by everyone. She was kind, devoted. This doesn't make any sense. But Garcia had been in this line of work long enough to know that people rarely showed their whole truth to the world. As much as Carlos believed in his wife's image, Garcia's instincts told him there was more to this story. He pressed on gently, asking about her recent behavior, any changes in her demeanor or habits. Carlos hesitated, his brow furrowing as he struggled to piece together memories of their last few weeks together. She was quieter, maybe, Carlos admitted slowly. More distant. But I thought it was just stress. Or maybe I wasn't paying enough attention. His voice cracked, the regret unmistakable. Leaving Carlos to collect himself, Garcia moved through the house, his sharp gaze taking in every detail. The home felt lived in, ordinary, yet as he passed through the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, a subtle tension lingering in the air. He approached the children's rooms, finding signs of their young lives, a pile of stuffed animals, a hastily colored drawing left on a desk. Innocent things left behind, now part of a household marked by tragedy. The detectives began their methodical questioning of the neighbors, hoping to uncover anything unusual about the family's recent activities. Most neighbors had nothing but kind words for Lucia and Carlos, speaking of them as a quiet, unremarkable family. But one neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, an elderly woman with a penchant for gossip, mentioned something that piqued Garcia's interest. I saw a man coming to the house last week, she said, her voice low, conspiratorial. Not Carlos. This one was younger, well-dressed. He only stayed a few minutes, but he seemed close to Lucia. I remember thinking, why isn't Carlos home? She shook her head, clearly relishing the attention. Garcia's mind raced. A visitor, young, well-dressed, and close to Lucia. It was a small detail, but it was a start. He asked her to describe the man, but Mrs. Carmichael's memory was as faded as her eyesight. Handsome, I think, she added with a shrug. Dark hair. That's all I remember. With nothing more to go on, Garcia returned to the house. He was determined to know more about Lucia's life, to understand who she was beyond the loving wife Carlos had described. He requested Lucia's phone records, hoping to uncover hidden communications, a lead that might shed light on this mysterious visitor. He combed through her belongings, searching for any clue that might reveal a double life or a secret relationship. Later that day, when the phone records arrived, they presented Garcia with an unexpected lead, a string of messages exchanged with a contact saved under a single initial, G. The messages were brief, often filled with vague phrases in a tone that suggested intimacy, a familiarity that stood out amid her other, more mundane exchanges. Garcia's pulse quickened. The nature of the texts implied a closeness, one that didn't align with her husband or family. Who are you, G? Garcia murmured under his breath, scribbling down the number and instructing his team to trace it. He suspected this G was the key, someone close to Lucia, possibly even her killer. As he waited for the phone number trace to come back, he felt the tension building, a sense that he was on the brink of a dark revelation. By nightfall, Garcia had received confirmation that the number was registered to a Gabriel Alvarez, the husband of Lucia's cousin, Mariana. Garcia's mind spun with the implications. Gabriel, a man intertwined with the Ramirez family through blood and friendship, was the last person anyone would suspect. He knew the devastation this could bring, the tangled web of relationships that would unravel in the wake of such a revelation. He wasted no time, calling in Gabriel for questioning. As he entered the station, Gabriel appeared calm, his demeanor cool and composed, a man seemingly unburdened by guilt. Garcia eyed him carefully, noting the practiced charm, the disarming smile, yet sensing an unease behind Gabriel's steady gaze. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Alvarez," Garcia said as he motioned for Gabriel to take a seat in the interview room. "I have a few questions regarding your relationship with Lucia Ramirez." Gabriel's expression faltered briefly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he regained his composure. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "Anything to help." But Garcia knew that this was only the beginning. With Gabriel's presence and the discovery of their connection, Garcia was certain he had stumbled upon a dangerous secret, one that would unravel the entire Ramirez family. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Gabriel, ready to expose the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of their suburban lives. The investigation had only just begun, and already, the secrets it held promised to be darker than anyone had imagined. Detective Garcia knew he was close to the truth, but even he wasn't prepared for what he would uncover. Gabriel Alvarez sat across from him, appearing calm but slightly guarded, his fingers tapping lightly on the table in a subconscious display of tension. Garcia had spent years perfecting his ability to read people, and he could sense there was more to Gabriel than met the eye. The smooth, charismatic exterior was carefully constructed, but Garcia was determined to see what lay beneath it. "Mr. Alvarez," Garcia began, his tone even but probing, "can you tell me about your relationship with Lucia Ramirez?" Gabriel leaned back, his expression carefully controlled. "Lucia was my wife's cousin, detective. We spent time together at family gatherings, celebrations, things like that. She was like family to me." Garcia nodded, letting the silence linger as he observed Gabriel's reaction. "Were you close with her?" The question hung in the air, the implication clear but unspoken. Gabriel's calm demeanor slipped, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face before he composed himself. "Close. We were friendly, sure. But not in any way that was inappropriate." Garcia watched him, noting the way Gabriel's fingers had stopped tapping, his hands now clasped tightly in front of him. It was a small detail, but it told Garcia that Gabriel was holding something back. He decided it was time to change tactics. "I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Alvarez," Garcia said, his voice low and steady. "We have evidence that suggests you and Lucia were more than just family. Phone records, text messages. They paint a very different picture. I'll give you a chance to be forthcoming with me before I put it all on the table." Gabriel's face went pale, the confidence draining from him as he processed Garcia's words. His mouth opened as if to deny it, but no words came. Garcia watched the realization settle over Gabriel, a mix of guilt and fear flashing in his eyes. The silence stretched, heavy and condemning. Finally, Gabriel exhaled, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "Yes," he whispered, his voice barely audible. We had a relationship. It wasn't supposed to happen, but," he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Go on," Garcia prompted, his tone unwavering. "How long had this been going on?" Gabriel swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the table. "Almost a year," he admitted, his voice strained. "We kept it a secret from everyone, especially Carlos and my wife, Mariana. Lucia and I, we were unhappy in our marriages. We found comfort in each other, and it just happened." Garcia let the confession sink in, the weight of it pressing down on both of them. Gabriel's words had confirmed his suspicions, but they had also opened a door to a far darker reality than he had anticipated. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a betrayal that had fractured two families, leaving a trail of deception and heartbreak in its wake. "So," Garcia continued, his tone sharpening, "you were with her on the day of her death?" Gabriel looked up, his eyes wide with panic. "No. I mean, yes, but I didn't kill her, detective. I swear. I left before anything happened. We argued, yes, but I would never. I could never do something like that." His voice trembled, and Garcia could see the desperation in his eyes. "You argued?" Garcia pressed, his expression hardening. "What about?" "She wanted to end it," Gabriel admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush. Lucia told me she couldn't keep lying to Carlos, that she wanted to work things out with him. I was angry, hurt. I tried to convince her that we could still be together, that we could make it work somehow, but she was insistent. She said she'd tell Mariana everything if I didn't let her go. Garcia leaned back, his mind racing as he pieced together the events. Lucia's decision to end the affair had pushed Gabriel into a corner, threatening to expose not only their relationship but the lives they had carefully constructed. The idea of losing everything had clearly shaken him, and Garcia could see the fear etched into Gabriel's face. "And when she told you that," Garcia said slowly, "you panicked, didn't you?" Gabriel shook his head vehemently. "No. I was upset, but I didn't hurt her. I left after the argument. She was alive when I walked out that door, I swear." "Then why didn't you come forward sooner?" Garcia demanded, his voice steely. "Why did you hide your relationship with her if you had nothing to do with her death?" "Because," Gabriel hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my family, my career. I thought if I just stayed quiet, maybe no one would find out." Garcia regarded him in silence, the weight of the revelation settling heavily between them. Gabriel's fear was real, and the tangled emotions he described painted a picture of a man trapped in his own web of lies. Yet Garcia couldn't ignore the possibility that Gabriel was lying, that his fear and desperation had pushed him to commit an unforgivable act. As he concluded the interview, Garcia's mind swirled with questions. Gabriel's confession confirmed the affair, but it left so much unanswered. Could he truly be innocent, or was his remorse a thin veil over a deeper, darker truth? And if Gabriel wasn't the killer, then who was? Who else would have wanted Lucia dead, and why? Garcia left the interview room, the shadows of doubt following him as he walked through the station's quiet halls. He knew he was close, but the full story remained just out of reach, hidden behind layers of deception that had yet to fully unfold. The pieces were slowly coming together, but the puzzle remained incomplete, each new discovery raising more questions than answers. As he gathered his notes, Garcia felt a renewed determination. Lucia's life had been built on secrets, her choices leading her down a path of betrayal and pain. But it was his job to uncover those secrets, to bring her story to light. And as he dug deeper, he knew that the truth, however dark and twisted, would eventually reveal itself. The discovery of Lucia and Gabriel's affair was a bombshell, but Garcia sensed that the explosion was only beginning. Hidden within the tangled lives of the Ramirez and Alvarez families was a truth that could no longer be ignored, a truth that would, in time, demand justice. Detective Garcia's mind raced as he exited the interview room, Gabriel's confession of an affair offering a crucial piece of the puzzle. But despite Gabriel's remorse, something didn't sit right. Gabriel had admitted to the affair, to their argument on the day of Lucia's death, yet he insisted he had left her alive. Garcia wasn't convinced. His instincts told him there was more to Gabriel's story, something hidden, something Gabriel was desperate to keep buried. Garcia paced the station's hallway, rereading his notes, mentally lining up each fact, each detail. Lucia's desire to end the affair, Gabriel's admission of anger, his fear of exposure, each piece pointed to a mounting pressure that could easily have turned into violence. Garcia knew he needed to confront Gabriel again, to press him further and break through the defenses Gabriel had built around himself. Minutes later, Garcia re-entered the interview room. Gabriel looked up, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. The confident, composed man Garcia had first met was gone, replaced by someone visibly haunted, a man on the brink. "Gabriel," Garcia began, his voice calm but unyielding, "we need to go over your story again. Because right now, there are too many gaps, too many details that don't add up." Gabriel tensed, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I've told you everything," he said quietly, his voice barely steady. "I told you about the affair, about the argument. I left after that." Garcia leaned in, his gaze unwavering. You left after an argument with a woman who was threatening to expose you. A woman who was murdered hours later. You expect me to believe you walked out without another word? Gabriel looked away, the weight of Garcia's words pressing down on him. I was angry, yes. I felt betrayed. But I didn't kill her. I swear. But you had motive, Gabriel, Garcia pressed, his tone sharp. You had every reason to want Lucia silenced. She was going to tell your wife, destroy your family, ruin everything you'd built. Gabriel's hands clenched, his breathing shallow. I didn't hurt her, he whispered, but there was a tremor in his voice that gave Garcia pause. Garcia continued, his words cutting through Gabriel's defenses. This isn't just about you anymore, Gabriel. This is about Lucia, a woman who trusted you, who was willing to throw everything away for you. And now she's dead, because of a decision she made to end things with you. Do you understand how that looks? Gabriel's eyes filled with something close to desperation, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for a way out. I wanted her to stay, he admitted, his voice barely audible. I loved her. But she wanted to end it. I knew I couldn't stop her. Garcia's voice softened, but his words remained relentless. So you argued. You begged her to stay, and when she refused, you got angry. You were afraid, weren't you, Gabriel? Afraid of losing her, afraid of what would happen if she told Mariana. Gabriel's expression wavered, the cracks in his composure widening. I was afraid, he admitted, his voice breaking. Afraid of what it would do to my family, to everything. But I left. I walked out before anything else happened. Garcia saw an opportunity, a way to break through the wall Gabriel had built around himself. If you're telling the truth, then prove it to me, Garcia challenged, his gaze locked on Gabriel's. Give me something, anything, to show me you didn't harm her. Gabriel's face twisted with anguish. I don't know what you want me to say. I left her house. I drove away. I went to a bar, sat there for hours, just thinking. His voice trailed off, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the confession. But there's no one who saw me. No one who can vouch for me. Garcia's expression hardened. Then you understand the position you're in, Gabriel. Right now, the evidence paints a very clear picture. You had motive, opportunity, and the knowledge that Lucia was going to tell your wife everything. This isn't looking good for you. Gabriel's composure cracked, his voice rising in desperation. I didn't kill her. I loved her. I would never. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. But Garcia remained unmoved, watching Gabriel closely, waiting for any further slip, any tell that would betray the truth. After a long silence, Gabriel looked up, his face lined with fatigue and regret. I wanted her to be happy. Even if it meant losing her, I would have accepted it. But I didn't. I didn't hurt her, detective. You have to believe me. Garcia leaned back, his mind racing as he assessed Gabriel's words. He had seen this kind of desperation before, had heard similar confessions laced with half-truths and hidden guilt. He wasn't certain if Gabriel was lying or if he truly was a man cornered by his own mistakes. But until he had concrete evidence, he couldn't be sure. And there was still one angle he hadn't yet pursued. Gabriel, I need to know everything about that day, Garcia said, his tone softening. Every detail. Where you went, who you saw, what you did after you left her. The smallest thing could make all the difference. Gabriel nodded, his gaze distant as he recalled the day, his voice hollow. I left her house. I drove around for a while, ended up at a bar downtown. I was numb. Lost. I couldn't believe it was over. He paused, his expression tightening. I stayed there for hours, drinking. Thinking. And then I went home. Mariana was already asleep. I I acted like nothing happened. Garcia's instincts flared. You acted like nothing happened, he repeated, a note of skepticism in his voice. But something did happen, Gabriel. Lucia is dead, and you're the last person who saw her alive. The words hit Gabriel with the force of a blow, and his face crumpled, the weight of guilt and fear overwhelming him. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came, his silence louder than any confession. As Garcia left the room, he felt the tension thrumming in the air, the unresolved mystery thickening around him like a fog. Gabriel's denials had done little to convince him, and as he walked down the station's dimly lit hallway, he knew that this was far from over. There were secrets Gabriel was hiding, details he wasn't yet willing to reveal. And Garcia was determined to uncover every one of them. The truth was close, he could feel it. But with each step, the stakes rose, and the darkness surrounding Lucia's death grew more profound. The pieces were falling into place, but Garcia knew that the hardest questions, and the darkest revelations, were still to come. Detective Garcia had spent sleepless nights poring over every detail of the case, each piece of evidence bringing him closer to a shocking revelation. He knew Gabriel Alvarez was hiding something crucial, that much was clear from his evasive answers and desperate denials. The affair had brought chaos and devastation to both families, but Garcia sensed it went deeper than betrayal. There was a darkness beneath the surface of Lucia's death, a truth that had yet to fully reveal itself. Then, one early morning, as Garcia was reviewing footage collected from a nearby convenience store, he found the break he had been searching for. The footage, grainy but clear enough, showed Gabriel's car parked outside Lucia's house on the day of the murder, during the exact time he claimed he had left. The timestamp left no room for error. Gabriel had lied. He hadn't left immediately after the argument, as he claimed. He had stayed, for reasons he had concealed from everyone. Garcia's heart pounded as he considered the implications. Gabriel had remained at the scene longer than he admitted. Had the argument escalated? Had he snapped, driven by desperation and fear of exposure? It was time for Garcia to confront Gabriel one last time, to push him to his breaking point. The tension in the interrogation room was palpable as Gabriel sat across from Garcia, his hands clenched, his face pale. Garcia dropped the printed stills from the security footage in front of him, each image capturing his car in front of Lucia's home at the critical hour. You told me you left after the argument, Garcia said, his tone deadly calm. But here's the proof that you didn't. So tell me, Gabriel, what really happened that day? Gabriel's composure shattered, his body slumping forward as he buried his face in his hands. After a moment, he looked up, his eyes haunted, defeated. It wasn't supposed to end this way, he whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't want. I never meant for any of this to happen. Then tell me what happened, Garcia demanded, leaning forward, his gaze fixed on Gabriel's every movement. Tell me the truth. Gabriel took a shaky breath, his hands trembling. We argued, she told me she was going to end everything, to tell Mariana about us. She said she couldn't keep lying to her family. I panicked. I begged her to reconsider, to give me more time. But Lucia was firm, saying it was over, that she was going to tell Carlos everything that night. She was ready to let everything burn. Garcia's expression remained unreadable, though his heart pounded at the unfolding confession. Go on, he said quietly, his tone devoid of sympathy. Gabriel continued, his voice barely more than a whisper. I was desperate. The thought of losing her, of my family finding out. I couldn't think straight. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. She was going to tell them. She was going to destroy everything. A tear slid down Gabriel's cheek, his eyes wide with the horror of his own words. I don't even remember picking up the knife, he said, his voice broken. It happened so fast. One moment, we were arguing, and the next, she was lying there, blood everywhere. Garcia's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. So you killed her, he said, his voice cold. You took a woman you claimed to love and killed her because she threatened to reveal the truth. Gabriel's face crumpled, the weight of his actions settling over him like a heavy shroud. It was an accident, he insisted, though even he seemed to realize the futility of his words. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to, but she wouldn't listen. I thought I could make her understand. Garcia felt a surge of anger, his sympathy for Gabriel long gone. You took her life, Gabriel. You took away her future, her family's happiness, all because you couldn't face the consequences of your own actions. The silence in the room was suffocating, the enormity of Gabriel's confession hanging heavily between them. Garcia rose, unable to stomach any further pleas or excuses. He turned to the officers waiting outside, his expression hard as he gave the order to take Gabriel into custody. In the days that followed, news of Gabriel's arrest spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The Ramirez and Alvarez families were devastated, torn apart by grief, betrayal, and the knowledge of what had transpired. Carlos, who had once seen Gabriel as a friend, a brother, now looked at him as the man who had destroyed everything he held dear. Mariana, once blissfully unaware of her husband's betrayal, now bore the weight of a double tragedy, the loss of her cousin and the unmasking of the man she had loved. In court, Gabriel's attempts to explain his actions were met with stony silence. The prosecution painted him as a man driven by selfishness, his desperation a result of his own choices. The jury, presented with the chilling details of the crime, was swift in delivering a guilty verdict. Gabriel Alvarez was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a punishment that many in the community felt was far too lenient for the devastation he had caused. In the aftermath, the neighborhood struggled to come to terms with the tragedy that had shattered their peaceful lives. Carlos remained in the home he had shared with Lucia, the memories of their life together haunted by the knowledge of her final moments. He spent his days in silence, a man broken by the loss of his wife and the betrayal of those he had trusted. Mariana, seeking refuge from the painful memories, moved away, leaving behind the life she had built with Gabriel. She took with her the memories of a love that had been built on lies, the realization that she had never truly known the man she had married. As for Detective Garcia, he returned to his work, his thoughts often drifting back to the Ramirez case. In his line of work, he had seen many things, but few cases had affected him as deeply as Lucia's murder. The layers of betrayal, the fragile web of secrets that had led to her death, served as a grim reminder of the darkness that could lie hidden beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives. And so, the story of Lucia Ramirez became a cautionary tale, a whispered reminder of the dangers of deceit, the lengths people will go to protect their secrets, and the irrevocable damage that betrayal can leave in its wake. The quiet suburban neighborhood, once a place of peace, was now haunted by the memory of a love that had turned deadly, a passion that had led to tragedy. In the end, Lucia's death served as a painful reminder of the thin line between love and obsession, of the destructive power of secrets, and of the devastating consequences that can arise when the truth is forced into the light. Detective Garcia knew that Gabriel Alvarez's confession alone wouldn't guarantee a conviction. He needed irrefutable evidence, something concrete that would leave no room for doubt in the minds of the jury. Though Gabriel's admission of guilt had provided insight into the tragic chain of events, Garcia was determined to uncover every piece of evidence, to ensure justice for Lucia and closure for the families. The morning after Gabriel's confession, Garcia gathered his team for a briefing. They needed to retrace Gabriel's steps meticulously, to verify his account and search for any discrepancies. His story, though compelling, lacked key details. Garcia suspected that there were elements Gabriel was still hiding, factors that might explain his state of mind, his intent, or the events leading up to the murder. They began by analyzing the crime scene one more time, focusing on elements they may have previously overlooked. Garcia instructed his forensic team to re-examine every inch of the Ramirez home. The kitchen, where Lucia had taken her last breath, was combed over with a fresh perspective, the once overlooked details now potentially holding critical clues. One item, a knife rack missing a single blade, caught Garcia's attention. The kitchen knife used in the murder matched the set, indicating that it had come from within the Ramirez household. This suggested that Gabriel hadn't planned the murder, at least not in a premeditated way, but rather had acted impulsively, a fact that could influence the charges brought against him. As they continued their investigation, Garcia and his team uncovered a second significant piece of evidence: fingerprints. Though Gabriel had tried to clean his hands after the crime, his fingerprints were found on the knife handle and on several other surfaces near where Lucia's body was discovered. The clear presence of his fingerprints contradicted his claims of an accidental stabbing, suggesting he had enough awareness to attempt a cover-up after the crime. Further analysis revealed traces of Gabriel's DNA on a discarded towel in the kitchen trash bin. It appeared he had used it to wipe his hands before fleeing the scene. The forensic team confirmed that the blood found on the towel was a mixture of Lucia's and Gabriel's DNA, linking him further to the murder. This piece of evidence painted a disturbing picture. Gabriel hadn't simply panicked and fled, he had taken calculated steps to cover his tracks, an action that pointed to guilt rather than remorse. But Garcia wasn't finished. He needed witnesses who could corroborate Gabriel's presence at the Ramirez home at the time of the murder. He returned to the neighborhood, revisiting interviews with neighbors, particularly Mrs. Carmichael, the elderly woman who had initially described seeing a man visit Lucia before her death. Upon further questioning, Mrs. Carmichael provided additional details. She had noticed Gabriel's car parked in front of Lucia's house that afternoon and had seen him leave in a hurry. The look on his face, "Detective," she whispered, recalling the sight, "I knew something was wrong." He looked frantic. Mrs. Carmichael's account, though brief, solidified the timeline. Gabriel had been the last person to see Lucia alive, and his hurried departure suggested he was aware of the crime he had committed. Garcia added her testimony to the mounting pile of evidence, each detail tightening the noose around Gabriel's defense. Garcia's next move was to revisit Gabriel's alibi. During their initial questioning, Gabriel had claimed he spent the hours after the argument at a bar downtown, drinking to clear his mind. But when Garcia and his team followed up on this statement, they uncovered another lie. Surveillance footage from the bar showed that Gabriel had arrived much later than he'd claimed, around sunset, hours after the time of Lucia's death. It appeared that Gabriel had been driving aimlessly around the city, perhaps working up the courage to face his wife or rehearsing a story that might absolve him of blame. With each lie exposed, Garcia felt the weight of the case solidifying. Gabriel's actions painted a clear picture: a man consumed by desperation, driven to a reckless act in a moment of anger, and who, in his attempt to cover his tracks, had left behind a trail of undeniable evidence. In court, this evidence would be devastating. The prosecution would be able to show Gabriel's erratic behavior, his web of lies, and his attempt to erase all traces of his presence at the crime scene. His fingerprints, the knife, the DNA evidence, the surveillance footage, all of it combined to form an unbreakable chain that linked him to Lucia's death. As Garcia reviewed the case file in his office, a sense of grim satisfaction settled over him. He knew that his relentless pursuit of the truth had uncovered a horrific reality, one that left two families in ruins. But justice demanded no less. Lucia deserved the truth, as painful as it was, and Carlos and Mariana deserved to know exactly what had happened to their loved one. The night before Gabriel's trial, Garcia visited the Ramirez household to speak with Carlos one last time. The grief-stricken husband looked exhausted, his face etched with the lines of sleepless nights and endless mourning. "Detective Garcia," Carlos greeted him, his voice low. "Is it true? Everything they're saying about him?" Garcia nodded solemnly, placing a comforting hand on Carlos's shoulder. "Yes, Carlos. Gabriel confessed, and we've gathered enough evidence to ensure he faces justice. I can't take away your pain, but I can promise you that we will make sure Lucia's death does not go unanswered." Carlos's eyes welled with tears as he nodded, his lips trembling as he whispered, "Thank you." As Garcia left the Ramirez home, he felt the weight of the case lift, if only slightly. The truth had been brutal, exposing a labyrinth of betrayal and tragedy, but now it was laid bare. Gabriel would face the consequences of his actions, and the families, though forever changed, could begin the long road toward healing. In the courtroom, the evidence Garcia had painstakingly gathered was presented piece by piece. The jury sat in silent tension as each fact, each damning detail, was revealed. Gabriel's fingerprints, the kitchen knife, the discarded towel, Mrs. Carmichael's testimony, and the surveillance footage together wove an inescapable narrative of guilt. When the verdict came, there was a sense of finality in the air. Gabriel was sentenced, his life forever altered by the choices he had made in moments of weakness and fury. And as he was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his actions bearing down on him, those left behind were left to pick up the pieces of a story that had forever shattered their lives. Garcia closed the case with a sense of solemn accomplishment, knowing he had done everything possible to bring the truth to light. Lucia's story was over, but the echoes of her life, and her tragic end, would serve as a reminder of the dangerous consequences that could arise from deception, desire, and the secrets hidden in plain sight. The courtroom was filled with a somber tension as Gabriel Alvarez's trial began. Family members, friends, and curious onlookers gathered in the gallery, each face marked by a mixture of grief, shock, and disbelief. The media coverage had turned the case into a local scandal, and as Gabriel sat at the defense table, shackled and expressionless, he seemed almost a shadow of the confident, charismatic man he once was. His gaze remained fixed on the floor, as though unable to face the weight of the accusations leveled against him. Detective Garcia sat among the spectators, his mind racing back to the months of investigation, each detail leading to this moment. He had uncovered the secrets, pieced together the lies, and built a case that painted Gabriel as a man consumed by his own desire and fear, a man who, when faced with losing control, had taken a life in a desperate act of violence. Now, it was up to the prosecution to present this story to the jury, to reveal the twisted web Gabriel had woven. As the prosecutor rose to deliver the opening statement, a hush fell over the courtroom. The case against Gabriel was damning, a blend of irrefutable evidence and emotional weight. The prosecutor began by recounting the tragic details of Lucia's death, her devotion as a mother, and the shocking betrayal that had led her into a deadly confrontation. Each word felt like a punch, forcing everyone to confront the raw reality of what had transpired. The affair, the threats, the murder, it was all laid bare, and as the prosecutor spoke, the weight of Gabriel's actions became impossible to ignore. Carlos Ramirez sat in the front row, his face drawn, his eyes hollow. Every detail of his wife's murder twisted the knife deeper into his already broken heart. To him, Gabriel had been a friend, a man he trusted, a man who had, in a single moment, destroyed everything. Carlos gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles white, his heart heavy with a mixture of grief and rage. Mariana, Gabriel's wife and Lucia's cousin, sat beside Carlos, her own face pale and tear-streaked. The betrayal had shattered her world, leaving her alone, grappling with the knowledge that her husband had not only broken his vows but had taken the life of someone she loved. As the trial proceeded, the prosecution presented each piece of evidence with calculated precision. Forensic experts took the stand to confirm the fingerprints on the murder weapon, the DNA on the towel Gabriel had used to wipe his hands, and the timeline captured by surveillance footage. Every piece of evidence was a nail in Gabriel's coffin, tightening the case against him. The jury listened intently, each revelation adding to the collective sense of shock and betrayal. Then came the text messages, the last digital traces of Lucia and Gabriel's affair. The texts revealed a relationship that had begun as a comfort but had spiraled into a toxic mix of desire, resentment, and desperation. The prosecution read aloud some of the more damning exchanges, each word landing like a blow in the silent room. For Carlos, hearing the intimate words between his wife and his friend was almost too much to bear. He lowered his head, his shoulders trembling as he fought to contain his emotions. When it was time for the defense to present their case, they struggled to humanize Gabriel, to portray him as a man who had made mistakes but hadn't planned to commit murder. They argued that the act was one of passion, a crime committed in a moment of weakness, a tragic mistake born out of intense emotions. But Garcia knew the jury wouldn't be swayed. The cold facts, the lies, and the attempt to cover up the crime were too strong, and the defense's attempts to frame it as a momentary lapse of judgment felt hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence. The emotional climax of the trial came when Carlos was called to the stand. As he took his place, the room fell silent, each person leaning forward to catch his words. Carlos's voice was hoarse, filled with pain as he recounted the day he found Lucia. He spoke of the moment he entered the kitchen, the horror that had frozen him in place, and the life he had once cherished, now lost. His grief was raw, tangible, filling the room with a sorrow that no one could ignore. Carlos described the woman he had loved, the woman who had been stolen from him by someone he had trusted. "I thought of Gabriel as family," he said, his voice breaking. "I believed he was someone who cared about us, who would protect us. But he took her away. He killed the mother of my children. And I have to live with that every day." Tears filled his eyes as he looked toward the defense table, where Gabriel sat with his head bowed, refusing to meet his gaze. The jury was visibly moved, some of them dabbing at their eyes, others looking away, unable to face the devastation etched into Carlos's features. Next, Mariana took the stand. Her voice was a whisper, shaking with the weight of betrayal as she described her love for Gabriel, her trust in him, and the shock of discovering his affair with her own cousin. "Lucia was like a sister to me," she said, her voice breaking. "And now I know that the man I married, the man I trusted with my life, was capable of taking hers. I don't know if I'll ever understand how he could do that, to her, to me, to our family." Mariana's testimony was a plea for answers she would never receive, a glimpse into the devastation Gabriel's actions had left behind. She described the life they had shared, the memories they had built, and how, in a single moment, it had all been reduced to ashes. Her face was drawn with grief, her voice barely audible as she spoke, each word underscoring the emotional toll of Gabriel's betrayal. As the trial drew to a close, the prosecution delivered a powerful closing argument, emphasizing the betrayal, the lies, and the callousness of Gabriel's actions. "This is not a case of a man who lost control," the prosecutor declared, pointing toward Gabriel. "This is a case of a man who made choices. Choices to betray, to lie, to kill, and then to cover it up. Gabriel Alvarez took a life to protect his own selfish secrets, and he must be held accountable for the destruction he has caused." The defense made one last attempt to sway the jury, pleading for leniency, but the damage was done. Gabriel's actions had ripped through two families, leaving wounds that could never fully heal. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with a guilty verdict. Gabriel Alvarez was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a fate that felt almost inadequate compared to the devastation he had wrought. As Gabriel was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom sat in silence, the reality of his punishment sinking in. Carlos and Mariana remained seated, both looking as if the weight of the world had settled on their shoulders. The lives they had known were gone, replaced by the bitter knowledge of betrayal and loss. There would be no returning to normal, no reclaiming the innocence they had once shared. Gabriel's choices had stolen that from them, leaving only scars where trust and love had once been. Detective Garcia watched from the back of the courtroom, feeling a bittersweet satisfaction. He had done his job, but the outcome was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the grief that lingered in the air. Lucia's death was a tragedy that had torn apart a family and a community, a reminder of the devastating consequences of deceit, obsession, and betrayal. In the end, the trial served as a painful conclusion to a story that had spiraled out of control. The families were left to rebuild their lives from the wreckage, knowing that nothing would ever be the same. And as they left the courtroom, the weight of that truth settled over them like a shadow, a permanent reminder of all they had lost. In the days following Gabriel's conviction, a solemn stillness fell over the lives of those left in the wake of his actions. The families were left to navigate the empty spaces where trust and love had once existed, to make sense of the wreckage left behind. For Carlos and Mariana, the path forward was uncertain, paved with the painful knowledge of betrayal and loss. The lives they had once cherished were now fragmented, each piece a reminder of a past forever tainted by the choices of someone they had trusted. Carlos returned to the home he had shared with Lucia, its once welcoming rooms now haunting him with memories of a life that had been irrevocably changed. Each corner of the house bore traces of her presence, a favorite mug left on the kitchen counter, her perfume lingering in the bedroom, the gentle reminders of a woman who had devoted herself to their family. The pain of her absence was visceral, an ache he carried with him every day, but Carlos was determined to honor her memory. He had loved Lucia, even if their marriage had grown distant, and he knew he owed it to her to find a way to move forward for the sake of their children. The community, once a close-knit neighborhood where everyone knew each other, was forever altered. People whispered about the tragedy, the affair, the murder, and the lives shattered by one man's actions. Friends and neighbors offered their condolences, but the weight of the scandal lingered, turning the Ramirez home into a place of quiet sorrow. Carlos learned to accept the sympathetic glances, the hushed conversations that followed him. He focused on his children, pouring his energy into creating a stable environment for them, hoping they would find a sense of normalcy amidst the turmoil. Meanwhile, Mariana struggled to rebuild her life in the wake of her husband's betrayal. She had loved Gabriel, had trusted him with her heart, her dreams, her future. Learning of his affair with Lucia, her own cousin, had felt like a wound too deep to heal, a betrayal that left her questioning everything she had believed in. But Gabriel's conviction brought her a sense of finality, an end to the twisted chapter of her life that she could finally close. Determined to escape the memories that haunted her, Mariana made the decision to leave Austin. She packed her belongings, leaving behind the home she had shared with Gabriel, the reminders of the life they had built together. She moved to a new city, seeking a fresh start where no one knew her story. It was a chance to heal, to distance herself from the tragedy that had tainted her family. With time, she found solace in the anonymity of her new surroundings, a place where she could forge a life unburdened by the ghosts of her past. For both Carlos and Mariana, healing was a slow and painful process, but they found strength in the simple routines of daily life. Carlos began to see small glimpses of hope, moments when his children would laugh, a sound that momentarily lifted the heaviness in his heart. Mariana, too, discovered pieces of happiness, a quiet afternoon with a book, a walk through the park, reminders that life, though fractured, could still hold moments of peace. Months later, Carlos and Mariana reconnected, their shared grief and understanding drawing them together. They met for coffee one afternoon, an unspoken bond linking them as they navigated the complexities of their shared pain. They spoke of Lucia, of the memories they held, and the sorrow that had changed their lives. In each other, they found a kindred spirit, someone who understood the depth of loss and betrayal they had endured. Their friendship grew, built on trust and a mutual respect born from the pain they had both faced. They became each other's confidants, a source of support as they moved forward. While they knew that nothing could erase the past, their companionship offered them a new beginning, a chance to rebuild their lives with someone who truly understood the journey they had undertaken. As the years passed, the memory of Lucia's tragic death faded from public view, replaced by new stories, new lives. But for Carlos and Mariana, her presence remained, a quiet force that guided them, reminding them of the love and loyalty they had lost and the lessons they had learned. In time, they both found their own forms of peace. Carlos devoted himself to his children, raising them with the values Lucia had instilled in them, honesty, compassion, resilience. Mariana, too, found her way, creating a life that honored her strength and independence. They remained close, a testament to the enduring bond forged in the aftermath of tragedy, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is a path toward healing. In the end, Lucia's memory became a part of the foundation upon which Carlos and Mariana rebuilt their lives. The pain of betrayal, the devastation of loss, all became threads in the fabric of who they were, shaping them into people who understood the fragility of trust, the cost of deception, and the strength required to forgive. And as they looked toward the future, Carlos and Mariana carried with them the quiet resolve to live lives marked by integrity, a tribute to the woman they had both loved and lost. Together, they honored Lucia's memory by choosing to heal, to forgive, and to continue forward, their lives forever intertwined by the tragedy they had survived but not defined by it. In the shadows of their shared history, they found light, a reminder that, even after the darkest nights, the dawn would always come.